Welcome to our talk, How Amazon.com Uses Regions, AWS Regions to Improve Customer Experience. I'm Frank Stone. I'm a Principal Solutions Architect. I work with Amazon internally to help them use AWS services. And joining me is Lisa Gudemuth. And Lisa is a Principal Software Engineer with Amazon, and she'll be sharing how Amazon uses regions. Now, before we get going, I'd like to just by a raise of hands, how many people have all of their resources today in a single region? Got a few. How many people have them in 2 regions? Quite a few more. How many people have in more than 2 regions? Awesome. So some of you are well along the journey, but looking forward to sharing some of the things that we have to say today. So our agenda today, we're going to share how our thinking has evolved around regions at Amazon over the time, and what we are doing today with regions that we maybe weren't doing a few years back. Talk about some of the learnings we've had that hopefully you can leverage and accelerate your migration to additional regions. We'll also then talk about some of the mechanisms that you can use to accelerate your adoption of regions over time. We're going to share some things that you may want to think about as you look at which regions you want to migrate to, some of the considerations that we've come across as we've gone on our journey. And then I want to share some of the tools that are in the AWS toolbox that will help you migrate to another region without having to develop all the capabilities yourself. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Lisa.
Can you all hear me? All right. So, like you said, I'm Lisa. I'm a principal engineer at Amazon. For the past 3.5 years, I've been focused on how we get the part of Amazon that isn't AWS into a number of more regions. So first I'll walk through where we're at today. AWS, I hope, is one you're fairly familiar with. Their strategy is region expansion. They want to take their existing infrastructure in one region and put it somewhere else. They don't really have to think about moving the data at all. It's up to customers to say, yes, I want to use this new region, and I'm going to get it set up to my liking. On the kind of rest of Amazon side, Prime Video was one of our first examples who decided this is something that we need to prioritize. For their approach, they went in, set up the infrastructure, synced the data as much as possible, and they actually wanted to be multi-region. They want to take requests for the same customer, for the same use case, and serve it in multiple places. This was really important to their business as they got into live events. They wanted to start streaming sports games and other high peak events, and they needed to make sure that they met the resiliency requirements so that, you don't cut out as you're trying to catch the football and make a touchdown. What they found was that the best way to meet those resiliency requirements were to start leveraging more regions. It also lets them take advantage of a number of kind of diurnal peaks, which let them lower their costs overall as they're using regions where the hardware is cheap in the middle of the night. Next, we had a team, Middle Mile, start looking at region failover. Middle Mile is in charge of moving freight around, so effectively taking your packages and getting them close to you, but not necessarily to your house. What they found was where most of Amazon was leveraging availability zone resiliency, and one AZ goes down, you can leverage another. They actually wanted to step it up where if a region went down or had a major outage in a service that they cared about, they could actually just fail over to an entirely different region. They wanted to keep the trucks moving so that we can get your packages to you as quickly as possible. Now, I worked in the rest of Amazon for most of my time. I spent 9 years in selling partner services. And what the rest of us did was just kind of get comfortable in a small number of regions. We had all the AWS services we wanted. Our availability was pretty good. We weren't really worried about it. Occasionally there'd be an AWS outage and we'd be like, oh no, we have to get into a new region right away. This is super important. And then a few weeks or months would go by and we're like, actually, their availability is pretty good. We don't have to worry about this on a regular cadence. Similarly, latency was a big motivating factor. At Amazon, we have the leadership principles, and the first one, very intentionally, is always customer obsession. We want to always be doing what's right for the customer. But we found other ways to deal with it. We got our CDN closer to everyone to help us lower the latency, and we took regular goals to make sure that as we release new features, we kept the latency in check for everyone. So it wasn't actually until last year that we felt we finally had the motivation where it made sense for us to start looking at more regions on a consistent basis. We looked at the Prime Video and Middle Mile success, And we wanted the availability. We wanted lower latency. We wanted cheaper costs that we can pass on to our customers. As there's new data localization regulations kind of in the works or being discussed, we want to be able to meet those very quickly without having to scrap entire roadmaps to make it happen. And we wanted to unlock new business opportunities. We'd seen the success with Prime Video, and we also think that once we make it easy to get into new regions, there's going to be a ton of new ideas we haven't even thought about yet as we kind of unlock what our business can think about. All of this adding up to we want to give the best customer experience. But our first goal, similar to AWS, is region expansion. However, unlike AWS, we have to move the data too. If you're going to the website for, Germany, you don't want to have to pick, am I going to EU West 1 or EU North 1? That's not what our customers want to think about. And so we actually have to be the stewards of getting both the traffic and the data to the right place. So we actually have to be temporarily multi-region. We don't want it to be the end goal yet. We want to build towards it. We want to make sure we're making progress. We're not stepping through any one-way doors we're going to regret later. But overall, we are viewing it as a temporary state that we're going to just work through as we get good at expanding to new regions. Then maybe we can take more steps. But there's a problem here. The last time Amazon as a whole got into a new region, dinosaurs roamed the earth. I was, fresh out of college at Amazon. We haven't done this in a long time. And our architecture, our infrastructure has completely changed and evolved for our newer systems. We don't necessarily always bring everything along, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. So we are fairly early in this journey, but we decided that it was time to actually start talking about this publicly because as we spoke with external customers, we found a lot of you are running into the same problems we are in terms of how to leverage regions. So how did we learn? How did we figure out what we needed to do? The first one is going to sound really silly, but we just thought about it really hard. We found a bunch of the folks who had been at Amazon a long time, who were fairly senior. Turns out they generally, have seen the things go horribly wrong, or they introduced the things that have gone horribly wrong, or will as we get into more regions. And this helped us find a number of things. Our configuration, for example, is going to be a massive problem. We'll get into that in more detail in a bit in terms of how we've let our configuration effectively atrophy over time. Next, we looked at AWS. We're like, hey, you're getting to new regions all the time. How can we build off your learnings? And there are a number of aspects around infrastructure as code, for example, that we've been able to leverage from them. But that's where we also realized, but we have this data and traffic problem. We're going to have a different experience than they are. And that's actually been a really interesting conversation as we work with AWS on that. They're like, oh, so this works like this region process we have. We're like, not quite. There's some differences that you're going to have to understand as well. Next up, we started prototyping. These are generally, hackathon level projects. We just want to figure out what's going to go wrong. It helped validate some of our assumptions, and it also helped us find new problems. For example, one I found was when you have an SQS source for a Lambda, try to switch one of them and not the other to a new region, absolutely fails out. But I got one of the best error messages I've ever seen from AWS, I have to say. So go team for SQS and Lambda, keep it up. Then we moved on to experiments. We weren't ready to get into new regions yet, but we needed to understand the latency impacts. If we add 5 milliseconds somewhere in the call stack, how many milliseconds is that going to be to the customer? How many times are we potentially going cross-region as we start leveraging new regions? And so we found some really interesting multipliers there that ultimately wound up shaping our strategy. Finally, we gave in. We said, all right, it's time to move now. Let's start doing this. And that's been what we've largely been working through over the course of this year. So what we found as we actually started doing migrations is the actual cross-region latency. We had the initial ping numbers, but turns out there's a lot more to it than that. There may be different links between regions. There may be, a number of security or networking standards that you're putting on top of that basic network that you want to consider in terms of what is this real latency we're about to impose on our customers. And so that was super interesting as well. If you're going to take anything away from this part, I definitely want to say get to migrations early, especially if you're a larger, have a larger tech base, number of services, diversity of technologies. This is where we've been learning the absolute most, as people start trying something like, hey, this doesn't work, that doesn't work. And so getting to this process quickly would have been really valuable. We still learn stuff in the early phases, and it's useful to work through them, but getting to migrations quickly is going to get you a lot more. Overall, this helped us get to what our actual strategy is. First, as Frank's going to talk about a little bit later, you have to determine where you're going, because there are nuances to the different AWS regions. Next, you want to evaluate the trade-offs you're making to set your strategy, especially around what applications or services you're moving together. From there, front-loading prerequisites, sometimes there will be things in your way where you can't really start until a number of things are changed about your existing service or architecture. Then there's kind of the standard of the diagrams we've been walking through of set up your infrastructure, make your data accessible, test the thing to make sure it works, dial it up, figure out how to observe and manage it, and then ultimately potentially descale depending on what your region strategy is targeted at. So that's our path. What can you learn from what we've done to potentially learn and do better? Or kind of start off from a better footing if you're building new systems. So we'll start at this trade-off and application grouping concept, because this is something that actually took us quite a while to sort through, and admittedly we're just starting to test it now, effectively. So as you look at trade-offs, you have to say, can I take an outage? Is this going to be something I can just kind of shut down briefly and then spin up somewhere else? What latency are you willing to pass on to the customer? What about your costs? Can you have parallel holding costs, and if so, for how long? How quickly do you have to move? This, a business nice to have, or do you have to get ahead of regulations and there is a defined due date you have to hit? And similarly, the effort, I'm very bad at this. For the effort, how much are you willing to front load investments in central tooling or whatnot to make it so that your builders can move faster at an individual team level? And that's effectively what my team's focus is how do we build the tooling to make this easier in partnership with AWS. Our biggest regret as we've gone through this is our lack of a service graph. So if you have kind of a knowledge base of how your services and your data interact, please don't abandon that. Build it up. It's one of the biggest things that we're working on. This is a snapshot of our graph from a few years ago, I think, at this point. But it's a portion of our services. We didn't have data in that graph at that point. And so there's a bunch that we've been having to figure out, again, by going to the tenured employees and saying, so how do these things connect so that we can actually try to guide this migration successfully? The reason that's important is because of the number of synchronous to the customer's experiences that we have. Taking the snapshot of our detail page, each arrow points to a different service or API call. So there's a ton, and this is just a fraction of what there is. So we have to figure out how to coordinate over and over again. How do we do this without just slowing down and waiting for everyone to be ready at the same time? We want to make forward progress. Part of what's been important there is figuring out how we can divide it up into smaller pieces so that we're not waiting for everyone. For example, some of our systems have human customers as opposed to computer customers. You have different latency requirements that you need for that. In other cases, there are specific countries that, our US marketplace has been around for a really long time and probably has a lot more cruft and a lot more branches than other places. So maybe that's not the one we move first if we want to limit what we move at each time. And then what's been the most interesting for us is actually above versus below the fold. So this is, if you load up a website, what shows up when it first shows up? What do you have to scroll to? You can have different latency expectations for both, and we're definitely taking advantage of that. A corollary to this that we hadn't really been thinking about as a company before is experience level objectives. We talk all the time about service level objectives. It's very well understood. Each team kind of focuses on it. But overall, if a few teams are a few milliseconds, over their targets, but another team's doing great, the customer still gets what you want. And so we've been trying to figure out how we define these at an experience level instead of each individual service. And it's really hard because we've got a lot of timeout files that look like this. And I'll admit this is an area we have not solved yet. But we've got one of our senior engineers on it right now. So hopefully next year we'll be able to have a talk about how we've gone from service to experience level objectives. Now, I mentioned configuration as a problem earlier, and this is one of the things in that vague bucket of prerequisites I mentioned. This is because of that region stagnation I mentioned. We got a little lazy in how we define configuration, and now it's kind of biting us. So this is how a typical Amazon configuration key starts. Prod is what we call a stage. It's, is this a production environment? Is this a test environment, et cetera. NA Amazon is what we call a realm, and NA here stands for North America. There are different flavors of this used across the company, but there's generally this pattern in most of our configuration keys. Then everything else is like, all right, this is actually the key. This is, I want to do something special in Canada. We call this kind of configuration business configuration. Then we have a lot of stuff that looks like this. Here, the main differentiator is the region that says, all right, for this publisher, anything in NA Amazon, it's kind of assuming it's running in US East 2, but this is the ARN to go look at. So this is our technical configuration. Like I implied, this assumes that Canada is always running in US East 2. So now we want to start expanding to new regions. What if it moved to US East 1? This initial key actually looks pretty good. Like NA Amazon, it's still there, we're all good. But what if it goes to multi-region in the future? Let's say we wanted to fail over to Brazil when something goes horribly wrong. That's not going to work. And similarly, the technical configuration already doesn't work because it's tied to US East 2. So we basically have to change all of our configuration, and there is a lot of it at Amazon. For our business configuration, we actually want to move to natural parameter. What should the key be? So instead of this kind of vague NA Amazon bucket that we've built up over time, we're actually trying to get rid of it entirely. It doesn't matter if this is a test or a prod environment. It doesn't matter where Canada is hosted. This is the configuration you should always use to Canada. So this is going to take some changes, but it's something that people are reasonably well understanding. Now, we can apply the same pattern to the technical configuration as well. Here, US East 2 is the actual parameter that we're keying on, so you could make this change, but we actually want to go a little bit further because you can really just name things by convention here. And where, if we took the US East 2 approach, every time we got into a new region, we'd have to copy, paste, modify, hopefully don't typo something. We can actually just say, all right, I'm good forevermore. We're all good. Don't worry about it. And that's the kind of thing that we really want to be driving our teams to, not necessary step, but it's really going to help us towards that long-term kind of region flexibility. We want to get to multi-region aspect. Now, to do this, like I said, we've got a ton of configuration out there, and we're adding more and more every day. So we want to shift to the left as much as possible. We start with, hey, you're going to do your region migration. Here's how to change everything you have. Then we're starting to move into, okay, well, when you send out a pull request, we can detect that there's some problems here. This isn't going to make it easy to get into new regions. We can give you some guidance. Then in 2025, we'll be looking at, can we get into the IDE? Can we help guide you as you're writing the code to make it easier? But again, then there's all the code that's already out there. And for that, we are actually looking at Amazon Q. Have to give the Gen AI spiel in a reInvent talk, but we are seriously using it. We're looking at how can we go in and actually send you pull requests without you having to touch anything. Because we're the folks who are the experts on how to get into new regions. And so we want to be the ones guiding teams to make those decisions of how to evolve their configuration instead of asking every team at Amazon to do that work. Now, that hopefully there's some notes there that you can figure out how to change your configuration over time to make it something you don't have to go back to if you ever look to get into new regions. And the infrastructure setup has a lot of the same flavors of problems. Now, infrastructure as code is something we really want because, frankly, ClickOp-based expansion stinks. We've had a number of teams start there, and they always regret it. Specifically for Amazon, we're looking at CDK, but it really helps with resource discovery and reducing manual errors. we found that a number of folks, either through historical turnover or the way services evolve over time, you don't actually know all the resources it takes to run a certain service. And so you start spinning up in the new region, you're like, oh, forgot that Dynamo table. Oh, forgot that S3 bucket. Wait, there was a connection there? What does that even do? And so when you have it in your infrastructure as code, you have that natural inventory of everything you own. And you're not going in, to the console or in the CLI to try to fiddle with everything. The number of typos we've seen and the folks just getting started on this has been crazy already. And so it's something you definitely want to get ahead of. Ultimately, we wanted to get to the point where adding a region is as simple as this. It's just in a list somewhere. But we're a ways away from that. If you want to look at how to move your existing systems to CDK, AWS has an IAC generator that you can leverage. And as you build new services, I recommend starting from infrastructure as code. I don't think I have to tell most of you that. That's something we've been doing for a long time. It's just that there's so much historical stuff out there for us. We have so many services that have just chilled, that there's a lot that we have to go back and modernize. Now, data consistency is an interesting problem. A lot of people are terrified of how we're going to move data across region. And rightfully so. This is something that we don't have good role models of how it's been done at Amazon. And strongly consistent data, keeping that in sync across multiple regions with tens of milliseconds of latency is a scary problem. Similarly, because we don't want to take downtime for a lot of our experiences, a lot of these have to be live migrations, which adds an additional angle of complexity. Now, if you can have eventual consistency, it's easy mode. And this is actually the route Prime Video went. Set up global tables everywhere they could because they were heavily using Dynamo. And that was pretty straightforward. A lot of the surprises we've had as we try to get into more regions have not been the most positive. It's a lot of, oh, we didn't think about that, or this is going to be harder than we thought. But the amount of services, or I guess data sets, that Prime Video was able to move to an eventually consistent model was actually one of our biggest positive surprises. They went through, they looked at the SLAs from Dynamo, and they said, actually, this works for most of the systems that we're trying to get into new regions. And it's just been a massive simplifier for them. They need so much less coordination between teams as they're doing traffic shifting, and highly recommend evaluating your consistency model. Totally recognize you cannot always move to an easier mode, but it's definitely worth an evaluation just based on how much it simplifies things. Similarly, calling back across regions, if latency isn't a huge concern, is a pretty straightforward way of handling things. Or you can start caching in the new region such that everything's kind of syncing in the back end. Now, like I said, you can't always get to the point where you're moving from strongly consistent to eventual consistency. I totally get that. But there are steps that you can take to potentially, even for your strongly consistent use case, simplify your lives. And this is actually what our advertising space is doing as they look to get into new regions. What they have are mutually exclusive key spaces. So they're going to try to effectively move one customer at a time. Now, it does mean they have the coordination problem between traffic and data, but it means that for every customer, they can pretend they only live in one region, and they don't have to think about how to get the data in sync over time. It's just that kind of momentary flip that's going to be the pain. Now, I'm going to cheat here. I have another box for the diagram, and that's always be modernizing. I think I've touched on it a few times, so you probably understand why. Tech debt is the bulk of Amazon's work to clean things up here. We've got the hard-coded configuration and assumptions, and that phrase, natural parameters, that's been floating around Amazon for 5 years now. It's something we knew was a problem that we took some steps to start fixing, but it really wasn't until we had to get into new regions that we're like, oh, wow, this is about to bite us. Similarly, how many people here have heard of Amazon SimpleDB? All right, 2 or 3 hands. This was a distributed, eventually consistent database Amazon launched in 2007. It's one of these things you can't find in the console anymore, but it's still secretly there under the covers. Yeah, we're still using it. We just never had enough motivation to change it. And what we found is there's a lot of things like this that create undesired technical diversity. And the problem there is now we either have to invest the time to get people off of it, which is what we're doing the right thing, or we have to start inventing ways to do data migrations for them, because that was not something that they were prioritizing at the time. And like I said earlier, manual management of AWS resources, this is definitely a problem that we've been facing. We're doing it right for everything new, but there's a lot of older stuff out there. So always be modernizing. I know it can definitely be a tough sell. Like I said, we knew about some of these problems before and couldn't figure it out. But it's definitely something that we've seen teams start to look at. They're like, oh, this is going to start being a problem too. And so it's really starting to slowly change the mental model of a bunch of the teams within Amazon. All right, so I'll recap my portion now. This took a bunch of different motivators to get through: availability, latency, costs, data regulations, new business opportunities. We want to make this better for everyone, but it took a while for it to matter, to be enough of a motivator. There's a whole flow we've put together, and I know I didn't talk through all of these. Testing, what does a WAN link dependency look like? That's something we've never had to think about before. Observability. I don't know if everyone here does it, but at Amazon, our engineers go on call. If I'm paged at 3 in the morning and I need to know where to look at logs for Canada, that's a whole different problem than it used to be as we're moving things around and getting into more regions. We're starting with region expansion as a focus, but we want to leave the door open to multi-region. And like I said, we have to be multi-region in the interim. But there's a lot to do there. There's a lot we're uncovering. There's a lot we're asking AWS. And so as Frank comes up here, if there are any ideas that you've been thinking through as I talk through this, or in your own experiences where, hey, I really wish AWS would do this. We probably want it too, so we should all kind of gang up on Frank a little together after the talk. So, Frank?
Thank you, Lisa. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what you should think about as you select a region and start your journey into the new region or to a new region. Our regions are designed so that they are autonomous, they're independent. And getting from one region to another is certainly possible, like two islands traversing between them, but it's not the same. Some of the things you have to think about, and Lisa touched on some of these, are what's the latency between the regions? Within a region, connectivity is very fast, single millisecond, sub-millisecond. You're used to having your applications have that level of connectivity. Our regions are typically a fair space apart, and we have this problem of the speed of light. And when packets transfer between one region and another, you've got to go that distance. And even though that may be tens of milliseconds, it's more than you had in your individual region, and something to think about. And oftentimes, applications don't just do one traverse of that distance. They do 3, 4, 5 traverses to do something for your customer. You need to think about that. And that gets to the reason that we care a lot about dependencies. Because understanding what your dependency does then helps you understand, do I need to worry about that latency now? If I leave the dependency for a while back in my source region, does that matter? Or am I really going to care because that's going to be very visible to my customers based on how my application's designed and how the dependency works? And then the other piece is eventual consistency. If I can wait, if it's not critical to have the data there exactly at the same time, 1 second or so delay, I've got a lot of options. If I need to have very strong consistency, then you need to think about either how do you move those pieces together with your region, into the region, the new region, or what can you do with your application to mitigate those issues with some of the approaches that Lisa talked about. One of the others things to be aware of is that there are a couple of different types of regions. And we have the regions we built originally we now refer to as classic regions. But since 2019, we've been building new regions, and those regions don't come by default as accessible in the console. You have to select or opt in to choose that you want to use those regions. So we refer to those as opt-in regions. So anything that we built from 2019, Hong Kong and later, I think there's about 12 regions today that are opt-in regions. And they behave a little bit differently. Now we changed the way IAM worked. We distribute credentials only where you select to the regions that you select as opposed to all regions, which we do in classic regions. So we have an increased security standard for IAM data. and you have to choose. And the way that you can choose whether you use a region or not, you can do it at the account level. And if you do it at the account level, you can use either the API, you essentially select a region through the API or through the console. Now, if you have multiple accounts, that can get to be a little bit tedious. So you can use AWS Organizations. And in AWS Organizations, you go into the console and you can select the region that you want. The benefit of that is that any region or any account that you add afterwards gets that same region opted in your organization. So it can save you some time and effort, some confusion as to why can't I get to this region type of a thing. The other nuance to be aware of when you use opt-in regions is that the security token service, or STS, works a little bit differently. Now, typically, we recommend that people use the regional endpoints, but the default for many years has been to use the global endpoint, and so people do that. And the security key is a few more bytes longer with the opt-in regions and in the regional endpoints than it is with the global endpoint. And so you need to essentially go in, it's a checkbox, but you've got to select to have the second version or version 2 of the STS tokens. At that point, it all works seamlessly across your opt-in regions and your classic regions. Now, our regions are highly consistent. The experience is the same. You go into the console, it all pretty much works the same, but there are some differences to be aware of. And a lot of those differences have to do with when the regions were built. And in our newer regions, we typically will only put in instance types that are the current instance types, or as new ones come out, the newer ones. But we don't go back and backfill some of the older instance types because those CPUs aren't available, they're hard to get. So if you've been in a region for some time and you've characterized your applications on the instance types that are in that region, maybe some older instance types, you'll have to go through the process of recharacterizing your instance types in the new region to use. Now, they're more performant and it's a better outcome, but you've got to do the work. Similar with some of our APIs, most of our APIs transition from region to region, no issue. But for some of our older APIs, we may have only built out the newer APIs with more functionality. And if that's the case and you haven't upgraded to use the newer API in the region that you're in, you'll need to do that work to upgrade or essentially to adapt your applications to use the newer APIs. Typically not a very large effort, but something to be aware of. And the last thing to think about is that you're going to have a number of services that you'll see announced this week. Those don't get deployed to all regions instantaneously across our 32 or so odd regions. And so with some of the newer regions, we may not have built out all of the services into those regions at the point that you're interested in using them. So just doing a quick audit to say, hey, are those regions there? If the services are not in a region that you're interested in, talk to your AWS service team, because they can both give you a sense as to when that service will be available or what your options may be. And then the last thing to think about is if you're a very large customer, you've got an event like Cyber Monday. I know we're scaling up today at Amazon for Cyber Monday. We plan for that months in advance. And I encourage you to do the same in a new region, is get to know from your service team what the maximum scaling amount is, if there's any issues with scaling up for an event. Typically, we can build out the capacity if we don't have it, but you do need to talk to us and plan if you've got a large event or something where you're going to do a very quick, large scale up in a new region. Now I want to talk about some of the tools that are available in our toolbox to help you with your migration, as well as some of the strategies that you can use with those tools. Now, there's different ways to move into a region. Now, probably the easiest way to move into a region is the new build. Essentially, that means you're not moving from another region, you're just creating your capability, your infrastructure in that new region, and you're able to turn it up at will when you want to. So you don't have to worry about the data migration, you don't have to worry about eventual consistency, that type of thing. Very straightforward. So the second strategy is the planned transition. Now that's a situation where you have the luxury to maybe take some outage, you can plan in advance, you know you're going to stage it, you're going to have everything ready, and then you'll have a cutover of some sort that will allow you to cut over your applications and your clients, and you can do it in a stepwise fashion. And then probably the hardest strategy, but one that many people need to pursue, is the live migration. And that's a situation where you've got to build out your stack in the new region, you've got to synchronize your data, you start to shift your clients over time, usually using Route 53 DNS, and eventually you get all of your clients to the destination region and you can turn off your source region. Whatever your strategy, some of the things you need to think about are, what's your account strategy? Now you can do this all with one account. You can use as many regions as you want within an individual account, and many people do that. If you want the additional security guardrails and barriers of separate accounts for separate regions, you can do that as well, but you need to set up the accounts before you get started, and so think about that. And then I just want to double down on what Lisa was talking about with infrastructure as code. If you haven't made that investment, please do. And one of the things that we've seen is that we know that when we move to a region, say we move to Canada, that's not going to be the last region migration that we do. And so we are going to reap the rewards of the investment that we have with putting infrastructure and code in place time and time again. It also pays dividends if you have to rebuild in a, say, an outage situation or if something happened to your existing region. So well worth the effort to do that. And the last thing to be aware of is that our quotas are region specific. So if you've had a quota that you raised some time ago, maybe for the number of instances that you want to launch in a region, that quota doesn't exist hasn't been raised in the other regions that you have access to. So you need to go through the process of either going through the quota service and having the limits raised or reaching out to the service team and getting the quota set. But think about that before you get going in your new region. Now, once you've picked your region, the first thing you need to do is you need to have connectivity. You need to have network access. And we have the AWS backbone, which is a robust backbone, have 400 gigabits or better, gigabits per second or better of throughput in all of the backbone connections between the regions. And it's a highly redundant infrastructure. So even if we have a circuit failure, that should survive because we've got multiple links. Now you can simplify the connectivity for your applications a number of different ways. And one of those is that if you have a VPC in your source region and you set up isolated IP address spaces between that VPC and a VPC in your destination region, you can peer those VPCs. And then you can connect essentially just the way that you connect in your VPC in your own region, just route to the other devices or resources in the new region. Now, if you have a more complicated infrastructure and you have multiple VPCs in your region, you're probably using Transit Gateway to route between those VPCs in the region that you have. And you can apply the same approach, which is set up a transit gateway in your new region and then peer the two transit gateways between the two regions. And again, you have routable network connectivity. And then one of the features that we announced just a little over a week ago was the ability to use private links cross-region. Now, up until what we announced a little over a week ago, private links were a great tool. You could use them within a particular region, but you couldn't connect across region. Now you can actually take those endpoints that you've created for your services and you can access them in a region remotely. If you haven't seen the announcement yet, there's a new announcement that came out today on the ability to access VPC resources, not just services behind a gateway, a NAT gateway, or a network load balancer or a gateway load balancer, but any resources can essentially be shared, see whether it's an RDS or it's an IP or DNS. So the power of what you can do with endpoints and now connecting them cross-region has increased greatly. So take a chance to look at the announcements and read up on the resource access, VPC resource access with private links. It's an exciting new capability. Now, once you've got connectivity, what people tend to start thinking about is that they want to connect their or move their data. And so how do you migrate your data? And many people, and certainly we do, use the simple storage service or S3 for data migration. And the best way to migrate your data is not to move it at all. And one of the things we found is that much of the data that we have in S3 are things like log files that we've been collecting and are good for some diagnostics, but really not needed to move across to the new region. Or we have backups that we don't need. We'll collect backups once we get to the new region. We don't have to move that data. And so once you've figured out which data you actually have to move, S3 has a couple of really good tools to help you move that data across region. Those tools are cross-region replication, fairly logical name, CRR, and S3 batch replication. And what you do when you want to copy a bucket essentially from one region to another is you set up cross-region replication. And once you do that, you first you set up create a new bucket in your destination region, and then you set up cross-region replication. And from there, at that point, you've got basically objects copying. Any new object created is copied to the new region. But you still have the issue of all the objects that are sitting in your bucket that were created before you set up the cross-region replication. And that's where batch replication comes in. So one time you go in, you set up batch replication, you tell it to move all of the objects from your source region to your destination region. And after a period of time, and you can monitor this with metrics, you'll see that you've got all of your objects in the destination region, and then cross-region replication is keeping everything in sync while you essentially do the rest of your migration. And one of the things I wanted to mention was it's always a good idea to do this before your primary migration. Copy ahead. So because the files are kept in sync and you can count on those being up to date, you can do this once and then do all the work for your migration knowing that your data is there and it'll be updated as your applications change and things change in the background. Now, some of the things to think about is that S3 bucket names are globally unique. And so that means that that bucket that you created in the destination region has a different name than the bucket that you had in your source region. So you will need to go into whatever software references that bucket and change the bucket name. And the other thing is that we have a default limit of 1 gigabits per second from a replication rate, and for most use cases, that works super well. But if you need something better than that, something larger than 1 gigabit per second, you can reach out to your support team and they can help you with the quote on that. Now, another service that people tend to use when they want to migrate or tend to be a part of migrations is DynamoDB. And that's a high performance NoSQL database. And the strategy, the tool to use when you're migrating DynamoDB for most use cases, and I'm going to mention a couple, but the recommended approach is to use global tables. And global tables is a feature of DynamoDB. Essentially what you do is you take an existing table that you have in your destination region and you check the box that says I want to turn it into a global table, and you list which regions you want to have that table replicated to. At that point, DynamoDB takes the global table, the table that's been identified, starts replicating transactions once it's created the tables in the new regions, and then replicates or backfills all of the data for the tables. And after a few hours, typically you have tables in multiple regions. You can read to those tables, you can write from those tables, and it's just a few clicks or commands that you need to do to get that set up. The other approach that you can use is one where you essentially take a backup of your table and you store that in the region that you're headed to, and then you can restore the table in the new region, and then you can get DynamoDB going from there. And that's another approach. Once your table is in place, or for the global tables, you have latency metrics that show you. Typically, it's about a second or less for the transactions to replicate across the tables. And I did want to mention, even though the replication across the global tables is very fast, it's eventually consistent. So if you have a strong consistency requirement, say maybe for a payments application or something like that, where somebody could be accessing multiple regions and checking the data within a second's time frame, then you'll want to handle that through some sort of application logic. Now, most of our database platforms have a fairly similar approach in terms of how you can think about migrating those platforms to a new region. Whether that's Aurora, DocumentDB, Neptune, Elasticache for Redis, or RDS, they all use pretty much the same approach. And that approach is the idea of creating a read replica in the region that you're going to go to. So a replica of your database, using that read replica, getting it synchronized, set up, and then moving the writes over to that read replica just as you would if you were failing over in a redundancy situation, except you stay there. And then at some point you can essentially cut things over. And this is kind of how it works. Now, it is an eventually consistent approach, and it requires a short outage typically for the write process. Now you can see here I've got essentially a client and a database that it's accessing. Create the read replica. You get the data copied over, start reading from the read replica. You switch the write over, and then when you're ready, you can disable the source region. Now, If you look at the kind of Aurora global tables, they've done some work in the back end to really make the replication very seamless, and the failover there is just a few seconds, and the transactions are very quick on the Aurora global tables. Some of the other databases, some of the RDS databases are a little bit slower, but all of this works pretty much the same way. And then kind of one last tool that I've kind of mentioned in the space of DynamoDB, but it works consistently across most of our storage and database platforms, is the ability to do a cross-region backup. So the approach here is essentially you back up, whether it's a data store or a snapshot of some data or the database itself. You copy that into the new region. You bring back the snapshot or the database in the new region. You restore that. And then you can start running your clients off of that database or data store. And with that, I want to share a few key takeaways that Lisa and I have from the overall talk. So as Lisa mentioned, there's multiple advantages to using multiple regions. You can get benefits from being closer to your customers from a latency perspective. You can have failover benefits. You can do load balancing or load sharing across your different regions. Or you may have data privacy reasons that you may want to have multiple regions. And hopefully you've gotten from our talk that planning is a good thing, and so you may have technical debt, and the sooner you start preparing for things like infrastructure as code, building it into your thinking that you may move to a region at some point, the better you'll be. Be intentional about it. Think about which regions you want to go to, do your investigation. And then when you do your migration, make sure you use some of the tools that AWS has available. Now, I've mentioned a few of them here. There's some more that I know will be announced today and later in the week, so keep your eye on some of the announcements. With that, I'd like to thank you for the time that you spent with Lisa and myself. We're going to be just right at the place where you came in for any questions you might have after the talk. And don't forget to fill out your survey. Have a great show. Thank you.